Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly webinar, where my colleagues and I will be discussing our latest research. My name's Chris, and I'm on the engagement team here at Planet Tracker. As always, we have quite a packed agenda for today. So in the next 30 minutes, we'll be discussing some of our latest research that we've published. The first topic we'll be looking at is our latest report on fertilizer risks. Next, we'll dive into the updated seafood database. And finally, we will examine Toray's climate transition strategy. Some quick housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions, please do add them to the Q&A. We will try and pick them up here, but in case we can't get back to you on the webinar, we'll also follow up by email later on. Please do leave your name and email address and don't submit anonymously if you would like us to follow up afterwards. Also, please note that links to all the reports that will be discussed today will be shared in the chat box. And you'll also find a QR code on the top right-hand corner of each slide for the relevant reports. And lastly, we will be recording this webinar. Now, before we kick off, I just wanted to take 1 minute to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. So Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. We focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We produce in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on the slide here. We're not for profit, so everything we do is for the common good, and all of our research is publicly available on our website or on your usual financial data platforms. And with that being said, let's dive into the webinar. The first piece of research we want to discuss is our latest report on food giants and fertilizer risks. So with me is my colleague Emma, the head of our food program. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So today I'm going to give an overview of our report, Food Giants and Fertilizer Risk, which analysed corporate disclosure on the risks associated with the overuse of synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer has supported dramatic increases in crop yields over the last 60 years, but with this, fertilizer-related environmental risks have also grown. The biggest of these risks is water pollution from fertilizer runoff from farmland, which causes eutrophication, algal blooms, and ecological dead zones in aquatic ecosystems. While the production of synthetic fertilizer is responsible for 5% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and fertilizer application can also create nitrous oxide air pollution, causing acid rain and smog, which impacts the health of humans and ecosystems. So this report analysed the company filings of 45 of the biggest global food producers, manufacturers, and retailers, with a total of $2.6 trillion in revenues across the group. This analysis used natural language processing to search over 5,000 documents, including regulatory filings, meeting transcripts, annual reports, and sustainability reports from the 6-year period of 2018 to 2023. Overall, we found that a third of companies failed to acknowledge fertilizer risks at all, and most disclosures lack meaningful detail. This might be because of the lack of regulation on fertilizer-related corporate disclosure, or be a sign of the competing priorities companies face in terms of ESG issues. Food manufacturers provided the greatest number of fertilizer risk disclosures overall, while food producers provided more detailed disclosures, but were less likely to provide disclosures than food manufacturers. Food retailers, on the other hand, provided the least disclosure overall, but this is perhaps not that surprising as they're the furthest in the supply chain from fertilizer-related risks. We also found that companies are beginning to understand key risks and impacts associated with fertilizer misuse and overuse. So 53% of companies' fertilizer risk disclosures included reference to reducing pollution, including eutrophication. 39% mentioned improving agricultural practices, including tackling fertilizer overuse, and 30% discussed greenhouse gas emissions arising from fertilizer production and use. And nearly half of company disclosures on the theme of improving agricultural practices discussed optimizing fertilizer use, which indicates that some companies are trying to improve the efficiency of fertilizer use and tackle overuse. Around 1/3 of disclosures on this theme mentioned organic fertilizer, but only 12% referenced regenerative agriculture, which really highlights that there's a long way to go in terms of deploying solutions to fertiliser misuse and developing more environmentally sustainable agricultural production overall. This indicates that more actions needed to tackle the misuse and overuse of fertiliser among the big food producer companies. So we use these key findings to highlight key ways in which investors can engage with food system companies to improve disclosure and action to tackle fertiliser risks. Firstly, by 2026, investors should ask food producers to publish plans to reduce synthetic fertiliser use by 70% by 2050. And by 2027, food producers should disclose progress towards this goal and investment in alternative agricultural production, including regenerative agriculture. Investors should also ask food manufacturers and retailers to report progress in reducing synthetic fertiliser use in their supply chains and report on how they are supporting suppliers with this transition by 2026. Finally, investors should require all food system companies to disclose fertiliser-related greenhouse gas emissions by 2026. And that is my whistle-stop tour of food giants and fertiliser risk.
That's great. Thank you very much, Emma. Next, I'm going to turn to Francois to provide an update on our seafood database. Francois, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. So today I'd like to tell you about our seafood database. For many of you, this will not be new, since this tool has proven to be very popular, with many financial institutions already using it. So thank you for that. But in case you don't know it, it's an interactive database that effectively enables users to filter through 300 corporates within the seafood supply chain and to compare their exposure to overfishing, illegal fishing, and many other financially material ocean sustainability risks. It's all in one place on an open access basis. Why did we put together that tool? Well, because seafood sustainability data is notoriously fragmented and hard to access. And yet, that data is a critical driver of the financial performance of ocean-dependent companies. For instance, in all of our research over the past 6 years, we found that companies engaged in, for instance, the sustainably managed Alaska pollock fishery boasted very high margin, contrary to the low profitability of the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, which is often embroiled in environmental and social scandals. We also found that companies doing good are doing well in the Indonesian tuna sector, or that IUU fishing is a serious financial risk. Or even if we zoom within one single company, we found that French retailer Carrefour generated its lowest margins on the most overfished species. So it does matter. And to empower everyone to assess overfishing risks and other sustainability data at seafood exposed companies, we released the second version of our seafood database, which covers now 300 companies, up from 100. If you browse through the 50 indicators we compiled, you can rank and benchmark companies, compare their financial health to their environmental sustainability, and also find more information on the areas where they operate, or the species they catch, they farm, they process, or they retail. Going through the database, we found the following. First, the global seafood supply chain is controlled by richer countries, but it extracts seafood from all over the world. Out of the 300 companies covered, 297 are headquartered in high-income or upper middle-income countries, But these companies source more than 1,000 species from all over the world. Secondly, it's good to see that sourcing transparency has improved since we first published the seafood database in 2022, but it's still gate-kept by upstream companies. In 2022, only 8% of companies disclosed enough information for us to be able to identify the species of their entire portfolio. Now that proportion moved up to 25%. It still reduces as you go down the supply chain. It's the highest in aquaculture, which makes sense. Normally, you should know which species you farm, and it's the lowest at wholesalers. But it's still particularly low at fishing companies, with only 32% of them disclosing all of the species they fish. Thirdly, which is more important for our financial audience, there is a link between natural capital risk and financial performance. We found a positive correlation between EBIT margin and the proportion of catches that is sustainable, and simultaneously a negative correlation between EBIT margin and the proportion of catches that is overfished. So the key data that investors in seafood need is information on the location, volumes, harvesting methods, and species of the seafood handled by a company. Why? Because this data determines pretty much everything else in terms of sustainability risk. Without it, investors are unable to gauge key financially material risk or reputational risk, such as AU fishing or litigation risk. And lastly, companies that do not have granular data on species exposure and harvesting locations are unlikely to be aligned with the TNFD or the omnibus legislation in the EU. So financial institutions should therefore demand greater supply chain transparency from seafood exposed companies. Concretely, what does that mean? It means asking corporates to disclose the what, so scientific names of species, how much, volumes of seafood in tons, where, the exact location of farming or capture, and how, fishing gear or farming method of their entire seafood portfolio.
Great, thank you, Francois. And can I just ask, what's next for the seafood database?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We're actually working to improve this tool, so any feedback is welcome. Right now, you can benchmark each company on each indicator, but you don't have a way to interpret what a certain indicator means. For instance, if you find that a 20% of the catch of a given company is overfished, what does that mean? So how bad is it, basically? So we are working to improve that. So by the end of the year, we will have added specific recommendation for each companies. And we will also create a new tool that will allow financial institutions to instantly know the seafood-related risk of their entire portfolios rather than that of each individual companies. If you're interested or if you want to help us improve the database, get in touch. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Francois. And finally, I'd like to pass over to my colleague, Jon, to discuss our climate transition assessment of Toray Industries. Jon, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for joining. As you may know, as part of our ongoing review of climate transition strategies across the C100 list, today I'll be walking you through the assessment of Toray Industries, a Japanese company. As a quick reminder, in our climate transition assessments, we look across 4 key pillars for the credibility of the climate transition plan of these companies. So we will start with historical climate alignment and then forward-looking metrics such as policy and governance, risk management, and capital allocation. So starting with emissions, Toray aims for carbon neutrality by 2050, but different from others, rather than setting absolute emissions goals, it relies heavily on intensity-based or avoidance-focused targets, especially when it comes to Scope 3. And to give you a bit of context, between 2019 and 2023, Toray combined Scope 1, 2, and upstream Scope 3 emissions grew by nearly 4%, but this comes mainly from the growth in upstream Scope 3 emissions, which is already the largest component of the company's footprint. And going forward, more specifically, these emissions are projected to increase by almost 30% by 2030. And overall, they have the likelihood of driving the total emissions at an increase of 13%, excluding the Scope 3 downstream, mainly because the company just recently only started to disclose that part of its footprint, something we encourage them to do next year as well. On the investment side of things, the company argues that, well, they are working and to changing that historical trend of emissions. And in fact, they are investing about 45% of R&D and around 20% of CapEx in what they call climate-related projects, which might seem like a very important and big number. However, I would say this should be taken with a pinch of salt, because the bulk of these investments go into product development rather than emissions abatement. So it's not directly linked to climate transition per se. Governance-wise, there are climate incentives in executive compensation, but they again are linked to revenue targets such as growth in sustainability, innovation, and not directly to emissions cuts, which again does not fully align incentives with climate transition. But looking at key issues and investor takeaways from this short summary, I would like to mention three critical issues for Toray. First, there's a lack, as I was saying, of absolute Scope 3 targets. And yes, the company has improved by disclosing downstream Scope 3 emissions in 2024, but they do not offer a pathway currently to reduce upstream emissions, which is the most important bit of their footprint, being nearly half of the company's total CO2 emissions equivalent at the moment. Secondly, while Toray does not conduct supplier assessments specifically, but does promote some CSR guidelines, there are no enforceable engagement emissions targets, no penalties, and no third-party verification of how suppliers evolved in their climate transition plan. And we believe that this undermines the credibility of its Scope 3 strategy, especially when it comes to pushing the suppliers to help them reduce that Scope 3. And lastly, I would say that executive incentives are good, but they are not fully aligned with climate goals. So on one hand, you would have heads of the department receiving some undisclosed economic rewards for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions on an intensity basis, but mostly executives are rewarded for sustainable revenue growth, so they lack emissions mitigation incentives. As an investor, if you are listening to this brief summary, if you read our report, there are three main questions we would recommend or encourage you to ask the company's management. First and foremost, will Toray set and disclose absolute Scope 3 reduction targets, especially upstream? And I know when we engage with them, they argue that they are following industry trends. However, there are more ambitious companies out there. You would have the likes of BASF, Bayer, etc. They do have absolute Scope 3 reduction targets. So saying no one does it, it's not true. Also, how will they enforce the real emission reductions in the supply chain beyond these sort of surveys they do, because we don't consider that to be a proper assessment and enforceable action, but rather something more aspirational, if you will. And lastly, if in the near future, do they plan to align the executive compensation in a way that is linked to net zero progress and not just sustainable product revenue growth? Lastly, I would like to conclude by saying that, well, it's true, Toray has made a bit of progress, especially when it comes to new disclosures, and we do applaud the product-focused sustainability. But if you look at its emission trajectory, especially when it comes to Scope 3, these are moving in the wrong direction. And without absolute targets, enforceable supplier engagement, and an incentive realignment, we do feel that the company is more likely to surpass the 2-degree pathway rather than be on the closer side of 1.5 degrees goal that it claims to support. So this would be the summary on Toray. I thank you for listening to us, and if you have any questions, feel free to send them over.
Thanks, John. That's great. Just a quick question for you. What would be a quick action you would say that Toray could take to credibly close the gap in alignment with a 1.5 degree pathway?
A really good question. And I would say something where Toray has the power to to take action would be by enforcing its supply requirements. So at the moment, there are no mandated emission threshold, no verification, and no penalty, all of which makes its supply chain strategy, as I was saying, more aspirational rather than actionable, right? So I do believe that solving this issue is key because its upstream scope emissions represent the bulk of its footprint. And again, for investors, I think implications are also clear because without Scope 3 targets and abiding supply chain measures, Toray ultimately would lack the credibility to achieve that 1.5 target, which I think we should all aspire towards.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, we are extremely ahead of time, but that brings us to the end of the webinar. So you have 9 minutes back. As mentioned earlier, if we have not got around to answering your question, we'll follow up by email later on. Alternatively, you can reach out to us using any of the emails you can see on the screen now. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you found it useful. Goodbye.